What's up, heroes? Welcome to episode 75 of the Producer Life podcast. Today I've got James Landino, an internationally recognized video game composer and DJ based out of Los Angeles, California. His electronic music bridges the gap of gaming, anime, and nightclub culture, and he's amassed millions of plays across multiple platforms. He's best known for his work in the musically acclaimed video game No Straight Roads, along with other projects including Tower of God, Chunithm, Osu, RWBY, Cytus II, Amplitude HD, and DropMix. He was once an audio developer for Harmonix music systems, although now he works full-time as independent talent working with the entertainment industry's best professionals. His notable clients include Sega, Square Enix, Monster Cat, Avex, Crunchyroll, and Rooster Teeth. In addition to his work as a composer, James tours the world as a performer and speaker celebrating video games and anime, and has shared the stage with renowned acts Inflow, Teddy Lloyd, and Hyper Potions. Recently, he founded Rare Drop, a music publishing company dedicated to building talent within the video game music scene. During the interview, James talks about his experiences as a game composer, why mixing for games is so uniquely challenging, playing for gaming convention Raves, and why Tokyo is such an interesting city. But first, cue the intro music.
This is the Producer Life podcast with your host, the House Ninja. Bringing you actionable ideas to improve your music and get it heard.
All right, James, welcome to the Producer Life podcast.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. I'm glad you're here tonight. And as I was thinking about where to start this interview, I thought maybe we would start with your website. One of the bits of advice that I had heard a long time ago is that your website should represent you in such a way that somebody can immediately understand what it is you're about. And you've got a very concise way of describing yourself on your website. You say you're a music composer and DJ working on video games, anime, and live performances. And that seems like a good synopsis for us to kind of use as an outline tonight.
Yeah. So that website, I'm glad to hear, sorry, I can't talk. I'm glad to hear you say that because I've actually, that website is brand new. It's like a 4-month project with a web designer over the last year. And it came out, I think, back in like April, I believe. And one of the big focuses was essentially what you're describing, because the way that I've positioned myself in my career, I can do a lot of different things. And as a consequence of past experiences, sometimes a person from the video game industry might be confused of like, oh, this guy does like DJ stuff and EDM stuff, but I thought he did game stuff. And then the other side of the equation, some EDM promoters will be like, oh, I thought this guy does video game stuff. Like, what's his deal, right? And so the challenge for me was always, how do I kind of communicate both in a harmonious way where anybody could go on my website or hear about me and immediately understand this guy is this niche, carving his own lane, doing video game music and dance music.
Yeah, and I think you nailed it there. One of the things that I was curious about, though, is you self-identify as a composer, and everybody else that I've ever interviewed has identified as a producer. Is there a reason you use that?
Yeah,
that word?
Yes. I suppose there's two reasons. One, which is, I would say I grew up as a musician, as a composer. I didn't come into this as a producer per se, even if that was the name that was probably associated to me, because I was always interested in composing for video games. That's how I got started doing this, when I was 12 years old. And so that name just sticks with me more so and what I identify with. But on the other side of it, it's funny. When I'm in a room with other producers, particularly with big name producers, I guess, without name dropping or anything, I've learned that producers will more often give me the time of day, or honestly, anybody will give me more the time of the day in a networking space when I say I'm a game composer versus a producer, because it helps me stick out more. And kind of on the inverse side of things, if I'm in a room with a bunch of composers, for networking, and like if I'm in like a game conference, if I say I'm a producer for dance music, doing game stuff, people kind of also inquire further. So it's to my advantage sometimes to use different labels in different environments. But overall, I tend to lean towards composer.
Okay. So you mentioned that you had a musical background and you kind of got started at 12. Can you go backwards a little bit in time and talk me through how you got your start with video games.
Yeah. So, I mean, to be honest, it even starts back when I was like 5, 6 years old playing my first video games. Ever since I played video games, I'd always been enamored with that medium. And even as a child, I knew that I wanted to work on video games. And I didn't know what exactly, but I knew I wanted to do video games. It wasn't until I was 12 years old when I had discovered this game that I believe is still online to this day. It's called Flash Revolution, which is a Flash-based version of a popular music game called Dance Dance Revolution. Mm-hmm. And so on this website, they had these, on the forums, they had open submissions for any musician who wants to put the music into the game through an approval process. And for some reason, that hit like a switch. Because I had been playing piano for a few years, just kind of recreationally, but I was like, wait a second, this game, this website is saying they want music for their game. Wow, I could be part of video games. That sounds so cool. I guess I know piano. I'll go be a musician, and that was kind of the start of the beginning.
Wow. Okay. So how did you develop yourself from there, and what were sort of your next steps as you journeyed down that path? How did you get into the electronic component of it, for example?
Well, so Dance Dance Revolution actually has a lot of electronic music. And funny enough, I would say a lot of producers in this kind of generation of music that we hear, a lot of them I find tend to be inspired by rhythm games like Dance Dance Revolution or Beat Mania. A lot of the Japanese rhythm games, like artists like Paul Robinson especially, he makes it very clear that he's inspired by those titles. And so for a lot of people, including myself, that was their first exposure to electronic music, albeit, a very, a lot of Japanese produced music and not so much from the Western side of things. But over time, naturally, as electronic music has become more mainstream, the gaps between Western music or Western dance music and Western dance music and I suppose Japanese, Asian dance music kind of combined, I think in influences.
Okay. So you had some exposure to sort of the genre through the video games. You had some technical skills through your piano. And then when did you first pick up like Ableton? How did that come about?
Ableton specifically, I would say I picked it up around college. But yeah, I've been using pretty much every DAW under the sun until that point, using, FL Studio and Reason and Reaper, Logic. At one point I was, just kind of jumping around. I think around like age of 19 or 20, around college, I went to Berklee College of Music to study music production and video game music there. And I think that's where I made the big leap.
Okay. What was that like, going through a formal college structure to learn the processes in the industry? I did a MOOC with a massive open online course with Berklee Online several years ago. Nice. Actually, interestingly, Ableton gave me a student discount because I was in a free online MOOC.
Nice.
I sent them the registration. They're like, there you go, 40% off.
Fantastic.
Woo-hoo!
Let's go.
Yeah. So I am also a student of Berklee, just not quite the same degree.
Yeah. Berklee was a pretty interesting place. Looking back on it, what I would say is that I didn't learn too much on I would say I didn't become a better musician from Berklee. Well, more or less, I didn't become a better producer from Berklee. I became a better professional in the industry because of Berklee. Berklee did a great job of kind of framing like I would say a lot of the foundations of what it means to be a good professional, in what their eyes is of what they think is a good professional, of course. But they gave me a lot of the foundation of, like best practices of the industry and best practices of networking, best practices of that sort of thing. And kind of going off that. Because because by and large, a lot of the techniques that I had been doing up until that point of college, I still do now. My philosophies and approaches to music have relatively been the same since I've been 12, 13 years old, which is kind of crazy to say. But yeah, that's how it's been for me.
So a lot of times producers and in this case composers, they wind up finding a particular sound or genre that they sort of stick with. And I think we could characterize, a lot of what you do is sort of video game music, but as I was listening to your catalog on Spotify, you have an incredibly diverse style.
Mm-hmm.
You've got everything from electro swing to progressive house to, it's just, you are remarkably diverse in your catalog, I guess is the best way to say it. How did that come about? Do you have was that deliberate? Hey, I need a particular sound for a game, so I'm going to go study a new genre, or?
Pretty much, yeah. So the ever since the beginning when I started writing music, my philosophy was always, I want to be able to have any idea in my head, no matter what it is, and be able to execute it to some proficiency. And that's even now, that's still the goal. Because I try not to, it's ironically, that's kind of changing for branding purposes, but traditionally speaking, the way how I got into this and the way how I've always learned is, I always just want to learn as much as I can, and I always want to feel like I can write any style of music, any blend or, mixtures of genres. It doesn't really matter. I want my creativity to be expansive based on what I know, as opposed to kind of telling myself like, well, I only know house music, or, well, I should only write house music because that's what people know me for. I don't really want to kind of pigeonhole myself into that kind of thing. Not that there's anything wrong with that, by the way. I'm actually recognizing the consequences of being too diverse from a branding perspective. But by and large, I always want to feel like I have an idea, I want to make that idea, and that's it.
Yeah, it seems like, and this is, I've had several people on talking about sync licensing, for example, and talking about the benefits of being able to have a very, explore your passions, explore whatever genre you like. It doesn't matter. Whereas there's many times a branding expectation for newer artists where, your fans like a particular sound. They expect to hear more of that from you. And until you've been around for, 5, 10, 15 years, you may imperil your existing fan base if you deviate too much from that original sound. So
I think even more so, it's gone. I think the way how people digest content now, to me, it seems abundantly clear that people will only follow a channel or a content creator or whoever it is. They really just want that one, by and large, they want that one thing from that one content creator, and that's it. And they want the hyper-focused, hyper-specific kind of specialization, I guess, if I could put it that way. And so, like I said, over the past year, I've recognized this, and I've had to in my opinion, I've had to recalibrate my branding and content to reflect that, because that seems to be the most effective way to get my name out there.
Okay. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? What do you mean how are you both pitching yourself as a video game music creator who can master any genre, but at the same time, telling your fans, hey, I've got this awesome sound, come listen to me?
So that's a good question. And the way I'm trying to parse it now, for one thing, whenever I tell people I'm a video game composer, I really lean to the fact that I'm a electronic video game composer. And that one word to me has made a lot of difference, I think, in terms of pitching myself to developers or publishers, because that makes me stick out compared to the vast sea of game composers who tend to be more rock or more orchestral. So on that lens alone, by saying I'm this electronic composer, that weeds out a lot of projects where, sure, I could do rock music or I could do orchestral music, but most likely I'll get the work that sonically also blends nicely or brands nicely, I suppose, with original music that's also electronic music. And so that's kind of where the times are coming in. I guess what I've kind of realized over time is that, or at least now, I'm in a position where I can be more choosy about the projects I'm doing that fit better with my branding. Not that I won't do projects outside of that, but from a promotional side, that's how I tend to approach it now.
Okay. How did you approach it coming out of Berkeley? Well, I assume you didn't have people knocking on your door as soon as you got out. How did you start building this this career that you've got now right out of college?
So that's a bit of a tricky question to answer from my perspective, because I already had some kind of internet following leading up into college. I went under a different alias at the time in high school, and I had some kind of internet following. And then at some point, I decided to transition into my real name. And so I already had some kind of fan overlap who was following my works or following my projects. And as a result, I had projects during my time in college. But I would say, to kind of properly answer your question, I didn't really focus on electronic dance music until post college when I had met a friend of mine who worked at this game company called Harmonix. Because when I had just gotten out of college, the goal was to get into the games industry. That was priority number one. And so fortunately, I was able to succeed and get a job at a company called Harmonix, which works on music rhythm games. So as I kind of elaborate more on the things I'm doing, there's conveniently a lot of tie-ins to music and games in pretty much my entire portfolio from since the beginning. And I've I've owned the fact that I've specialized in that gap of music and video games.
Okay, so your catalog is quite large. Right. So a couple of the recent ones that I was hoping maybe we could talk about, the No Straight Roads game collaboration that came out last year. That was a pretty massive product with Metronomic.
Yes.
Tell us first a little bit about the game, and then how the process of composing the tracks that you wrote on that came about.
Sure. So No Straight Roads is an musical action platformer where you have to defeat the evil record label with the power of rock music. And so, ironically enough, as we're talking about electronic music, kind of the joy of the project was I was essentially writing music for the bad guys. It was kind of fun being the villain, right? And so through that process of the game, what was so special about the game actually was that as you fight against these musical bosses, the music dynamically changes to different genres. So you play as this duo, Mayday and Zook, who are in this rock band called Bunk Bed Junction, and you defeat these evil EDM bosses. Like ranging from house music to future bass, to synthwave, right? And so one of us would write the original piece of music, usually in some either rock or some other genre, and then I would write the electronic version of that song. And so as you fight the boss and you deal more damage or do activate certain actions in the game, the music will blend from rock music to dance music to kind of create that effect of the kind of like that real Battle of the Bands kind of musicality. And so that was a really interesting process of writing music for that game.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. Out of curiosity, what genre is the final boss?
So the final boss of the game, spoilers for those of you who don't want to hear this, plug your ears. But so the final boss of the game is actually you find out that the person who runs the record label was actually a rock musician in the first place and then switched to dance music because I guess it was more marketable, or was the evil, EDM is evil in that world. And so the final boss was actually a very strong hybrid of rock music, electronic music, and orchestral music all in one in this kind of big epic battle.
Interesting. Okay. Did you have a favorite track out of that project?
Good question. I would say, I think the track that I go back most to, one of the bosses is a K-pop boy band, and so I wrote the track, I wrote the original song for that, and that was a lot of fun to write some kind of pseudo K-pop music. That was a lot of fun.
Okay, so when you're asked to write a track that's in a genre you haven't written before, whether that's electro swing or K-pop or something like that, how do you teach yourself a new genre?
Let me think about that for a second. I think the first place I would go to is a reference point. Usually these days, because I've written a lot of different genres, I think when I'm presented a genre that I'm not that familiar with, it's usually through a client for a project, and the best place I start with are a few reference points. And then from there, what I'm usually identifying is what are the key sounds or instrumentation. If I can at least get the instrumentation down, or of what I'm able to create within reasonable time, that gets me to, I think, about 80% of the result I want. Because I can write music for days, I can just keep writing forever. My challenge from a producer lens, my challenge was always being able to produce their sound that I've just kind of have meticulously worked on over years and years of practice. But as a composer, I can just write a song forever until the end of time. So I think for me, it's starting at the reference point of what sounds do I need to create, and then executing the writing of those sounds.
Okay. What about, how do you just use a reference track to try to figure out how this genre works in terms of arrangements and rhythmic patterns? And are you just listening to a couple of different reference tracks and picking it out? Or do you go out and research it on Wikipedia? Or
so by and large, I'm just using my ears. I've spent a lot of years just doing ear training. I got very good at my ear. I got very strong ears musically because when I was a child, I would transcribe a lot of video game music that just doesn't have sheet music for it. At least back then, there wasn't any sheet music for it, and so I got really good at being able to just figure out, oh, these chords are this just by hearing it, or this melody is this just by hearing it. And so then moving onward into college is when I started practicing. Oh, you can get this sound by making this wave with this effect and da da da. And I spent a lot of time practicing just that kind of ability of mentally hearing something or hearing something in actuality from a reference track and just literally recreating it to the best of my ability.
Okay. Do you, as you're getting ready to take on a video game project, how does that typically evolve? They will send you some reference tracks. Do you get to play a demo version of the game, or do you just work off of a description of the game? Or
it's funny. Video game development is it's all over the place. Every project is kind of a new, different kind of chaos. It really is. You would think there'd be more standardization in how to approach game development, and there is kind of, but by and large, my experiences with No Straight Roads is completely different than the kind of games I worked on from a process standpoint. Was completely different than how I worked on games at Harmonix, for example. And even at Harmonix, that process was completely different, based on on whatever title I was working on. So sometimes if I'm fortunate enough, I'll be able to play a demo or a prototype or proof of concept of the game. But for example, on a game like DropMix, which is a DJ card game, I was involved in the prototyping process, right? Versus say No Straight Roads, where I was involved towards almost the alpha beta, which is towards the very end of development. So it's really just all over the place in terms of when I'm involved and what kind of involvement I'm involved with, because most of my projects are music games. And so different kinds of video games which involve music means that I may need to be more involved at different stages of development, if that makes sense.
It does, and it's interesting you say that, because some of the folks that have come on and talked about sync licensing, for example, have told me that for TVs and movies, frequently music is the very last step. And so there's a major push and a big rush last minute to pick a song, make a decision, and it's a very quick last minute process. It's interesting to me that video games, maybe some of them are like that, but others start planning the music very early on. Right,
and very rarely, when we're in the sync world, that's a different kind of music application than kind of what I'm doing, because I would consider myself in that role more as like an audio developer for video games and a game composer than, let's say, like I don't want to put words into other producers' mouths who've come on our show, but I imagine even though they have music in a game, they may not immediately say that they're a game composer, I would assume. I think they would just say, I'm a producer who's had the music in video games, right? So my role is a bit more different, because the kind of skill set needed in that role is so much more nuanced in understanding game development, especially when there's games with music as part of the core gameplay.
Okay. And I'm sorry if I'm doing a lot of comparisons with the sync world that I'm a little more familiar with, but one of the things that they've also described is when you're writing for sync, you basically break your tracks down into multiple different marketable assets.
Right.
You've got instrumental pieces, maybe an orchestral piece. You've got, so each of those is syncable in and of itself. You're creating different assets in the hopes that somebody will pick it up, and it makes it easier for the music manager if they've got multiple different versions of the same thing. Can you kind of contrast that with what is the process like and what's going through your head as you are writing a track for like a boss fight in a video game?
So I'll try not to be a broken record as I say this, but the truthful answer is that it's completely different per project. So in a case like No Straight Roads, because the reason why is that every game I've worked on has a completely different audio engine. You have to think about of how the game's tech handles the audio. So in a game like No Straight Roads, the basics of the tech, or I'm explaining the basics of the tech, is that there were 3 or 4 different I'd say 3 different stems. There is a bass stem, a drum stem, and a harmony stem that we had to kind of separate into each version of the song. And so in a boss level, so for the boss levels in No Straight Roads, there were 3 different genres per boss, meaning that there's 9 stems total of the 3 different genres. And so I have to, when I'm writing a piece of music, in that example, I have to write a song knowing that it can work with the different mashups of the different stems that we could play with. So the way it's kind of, for most music games I've worked on, the kind of recurring theme that I see is that it's kind of like a musical puzzle. How can I make this song I'm writing also be written in a way where if someone else were to remix it, it can still work nicely while leaving room for them to be creative in their own, to make their own style of remix. Does that make sense?
I think so. So you've got 9 different stems, and then I guess depending on what phase of a level or a particular fight, different stems may kind of automatically be mixed in by the audio engine. And so you have to make sure that regardless of how all those pieces fall together, you don't wind up with, squelchy resonant frequencies, and they all have to play together regardless of where they come in and out. Is that
more or less? Exactly. Yeah, it's less on the mixing end, because honestly, mixing for video games is an absolute nightmare and arguably impossible from a true mixing engineer's perspective. I would say mixing for games is very, very difficult because there's just so much dynamic audio happening at any given moment, any time. It's not like normal, quote unquote, normal linear music where, the mix is set because, you play a song from start to finish, just incorporating ambience and sound effects. And at what points in time, it becomes a very involved process to make sure everything frequency wise sounds good, let alone harmonically speaking, when we get into games like No Straight Roads, which involves dynamic harmonic changing.
Wow. I'd never thought about that. I guess I had assumed it was kind of like sidechain compression. When a video game sound effect goes off, you punch a boss in the nose, it ducks the audio frequency, but I guess there's a lot more that goes into that.
Sometimes it's that simple. Other times it can be, more involved where, maybe if a sound effect, because if you punch a boss in the nose, for example, and the audio ducks, what happens if you keep punching them? Then the audio just keeps saying ducked, and it might sound terrible in this theoretical example I'm providing, right? And so you have to kind of think of different ways of, okay, if they keep punching it, maybe then we duck it the first time, but after 3 or 5 seconds, we can't just keep ducking it. There's all this kind of, then we're getting to the layer of the psychoacoustics where, okay, if I punch someone the first time and you hear that ducking, if you keep repeatedly punching them, our brains are going to keep assuming that sound is there, even if we can't hear it as clearly. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I imagine it gets even more complicated when you start dealing with multiplayer games.
Exactly.
What sounds are you playing for which player at a given time? If one character is swinging a sword and another one is casting spells, can the sword swinger hear the full effect of the spell casting, for example?
Exactly. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with a lot of multiplayer games, like if you play games like Overwatch or Call of Duty or
World of Warcraft.
Yeah. World of Warcraft is a great example, right? And so one of the biggest challenges in audio development, in an example you're providing, is audio prioritization. It's essentially what sounds should we actually even prioritize for the player to hear? Because, in a world where there's so many players in front of you, where in theory you could hear literally thousands of sound effects at once, we obviously don't want you to hear that. So we want you to hear, we have a system that we code and program that decides, okay, what's most important? Okay, if you're in front of this enemy monster, we want to make sure you hear that enemy monster sound effects, even though some other guy next to you is doing these other things. And that's just one nice example, right? So it can get really involved really quickly.
Yeah, and when you're dealing with first-person shooters, you certainly need to know directional information, and proximity is really important.
Exactly.
So,
yep.
Interesting. So all of that, I guess you said we program. Are you involved with that programming process, or is that just something that you kind of provide some input into?
More on the design and input side. I'm not usually doing the literal programming because that's not my forte. Usually there's like a dedicated team of audio programmers. But for a game like DropMix, the DJ card game I had mentioned prior, that was a project where I was really involved in the design of how we want to create this system, and then someone executes that system to create.
That game sounds really interesting to me. So it's a DJ card game. How does that work? Tell us some more about DropMix.
Yes, I would say from an audio system, it is, I think, one of the most interesting. I'm biased, of course, but I think it's one of the most interesting and involved. I think it's one of the interesting, most complex audio systems I've seen in a video game. And so, DropMix is a DJ card game that Hasbro had collaborated with Harmonix. And so the term that Hasbro used was called phygital. It was digital and physical because you were dealing with a physical board and physical cards, and these cards had RFID chips with baked in audio inside those cards. Like think of like you're a DJ, and so think of every card as a vinyl CD, right? And so inside every card is a piece of music that you play on this special board that then plays that piece of music, or that's, in this case, a stem of music. And so we basically created this whole system where anyone could play any, assortment of 150 cards, and it would musically sound good, no matter what tempo, what key, doesn't matter. We programmed it where there'd be a slave and master, and we'd kind of, built that in such a smart, integrated way where literally anyone with no musical understanding could just play any cards and have fun.
Wow. How in the world did you do that without just sticking to a couple of compatible keys?
So the way that we did it, I'll do my best to kind of summarize because it can get a little crazy, but the way that we approached it was that the first card you play in the mat would essentially be the master. That would dictate, okay, we're in this key and this BPM. And then any subsequent cards you play after would dictate to would change to that.
Okay.
And so naturally you're gonna get a lot of weird edge cases where it's like, okay, if we're playing a card that's at 120 BPM, but this song's at 180, how the heck can you make that sound good? And there's, of course, we have to kind of do some mathematical fudging around to make it fit as best we can. But but we do the best we can, more or less. It still sounds good to me. And so what we do also to kind of break the monotony was we'd have these special cards. I forgot the name of them because it's been a few years since, but there'd be a special card that would basically, when you play that special card, it would then become the new master. And then all the cards on the board would shift into that new key, that new BPM. And so if you had a board and a set of cards, right, you could just mix and match for literally hours, just kind of having your own DJ set.
I'm going to have to go look up that game. That sounds like a lot of fun.
It's a lot of fun. Yeah. We honestly, like, of all the games I've ever worked on, like that, like even as we're building the prototype for this, like we would just spend hours after work just playing the tech because the tech is just it was so much fun. Yeah,
that does sound cool. So, all right, that brings up another question. So let's say I go out and find a copy of DropMix and I purchase it. How are you paid as the composer? On most of these agreements, are you paid back-end royalties? Are you paid an upfront fee? Is it some combination of both? So how does that work for you?
So for Harmonix, so I was a full-time employee at Harmonix. I was essentially an audio developer. So in that context, I didn't get any kind of residuals from those sales because I was paid a full-time salary. But post Harmonix, to kind of answer your question, as an independent contractor or as a client, typically with corporate, it's usually a buyout because companies don't like the idea of giving an individual some kind of control of any kind. That's just because they're a little paranoid, and I understand why to some degree. But on the more indie level, or I guess AA level of game developers, there's a bit more negotiation involved. So for a game like No Straight Roads, for example, I would get residuals on the soundtrack, right? I get paid up front, and I get residuals on the soundtrack. There have been a few rare cases where I would get game sales if that was part of the negotiation for some reason, if they didn't have immediate budget for me. But yeah, in most projects, I would get the upfront commission rate and then the residuals of soundtrack sales.
Okay. So we've talked about a couple of different games, sort of a fairly recent one from a few years back. I noticed on Twitter that you are starting to work with a new game, or you're planning on putting some music out for a game called Presentiment as of about 6 hours ago. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why you decided to jump on that project?
Sure. So Presentiment is a new project that I got hit up for probably about like a month ago, and they're a team of indie developers who had worked on a previous title called Omori. Omori was kind of a viral indie game that got a lot of game sales. I think they've had like almost like, viral for indie is usually around like at least over 100,000 copies. I think they've hit even higher than that, to be honest, maybe almost 1 million, I think. A big number.
Okay.
And so these developers are starting a new project. And so they have me involved. I can't say exactly what my involvement is for NDA reasons, but I would be doing some kind of music. If they found me through my work from No Straight Roads, and they kind of want to take some of that knowledge that I have on that game's development into what they're doing.
Okay. And it looks pretty early in the process since they're just in the Kickstarter phase.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll include a link to that in the show notes. So the video game, being a composer for video games is part of what you do. Obviously, in your description on your website, you also talk about DJing. And as I was looking at your various social media profiles, it looks like you've done a fair amount of performing, a lot of times at gaming conventions. How did you break into that gaming convention market? Was that people reaching out to you? Are you contacting them through a booking agent? Or how do a lot of your performances come about these days?
So these days I have, it's all over the place. I do have, I guess what you call a convention agent who gets me a few opportunities, per year. But a lot of times, these conventions reach out directly because, it's funny. As we've seen kind of, I guess, quote unquote, nerd culture get more into the mainstream over the past 10 years, there's been, a much more interest in conventions or spaces for people to celebrate, that nerdom of gaming or anime or, cons or comic books. Right. And so these conventions naturally, as a tradition of most conventions, there's these raves or nightclub events. And so they'll usually like to find talent that people will be familiar with, or if they're not quite familiar with, they're in the industry, right, of that space. And so that's usually how I get hit up, because there really aren't a lot of right. Essentially I'm a pretty niche thing. Like as a DJ who also does game music or anime stuff, like there aren't a lot of people who can fill that role adequately just by sheer numbers. No. Right. So that's usually how I get my work, because it's like, okay, James is someone who we know is that person who can do that who can perform and we think people will like.
Yeah. So, I mean, that makes perfect sense. You've got an instant connection with the gaming crowd. And if you play some of the tracks that you've composed, then, that will instantly resonate with them. Do you, when you are playing tracks that you've composed, do you frequently remix them and make them a more dancey beat in some cases, or are you playing the tracks straight as you compose them, or do you have a particular process as you're preparing for a live performance?
I would say it's kind of all over the place. Sometimes I will remix my own song to be more dancey. A lot of the music that I write for games are already fairly danceable songs by some measure.
Yeah. Since you're doing rhythm games.
Exactly. So it's kind of a mix of both, and I try to, I still like to be a DJ who is still, not playing just my own music. And so a lot of times I'll take a lot of popular music, popular music, whether it's like a Nicki Minaj or, a Cardi B, for example, and mashing that up with some game music and, really just having fun with kind of celebrating, to me, the goal is because I guess what I'll say it this way, a lot of conventions, when they have these rave events or nightclub events, it's not going to be just people who, like nerdy music. It's going to be just people who just want to party and have a good time. And so one of my jobs, or I guess what kind of my wishes, is to see if I can get people to dance to music that also happens to be kind of nerdy, and so if I find some sneaky ways to combine, like Final Fantasy music with some, hip hop track or some dance track, it's kind of a rare moment where you see, kind of ravers and, nerdy people going off and having a fun time together.
Yeah, and I think that's probably part of the appeal of the raves at those big festivals is that it is a place that nerds and geeks can feel comfortable being themselves, but also, they may not be comfortable at a traditional dance club or festival. And so, if you want to show up in your Harry Potter robes, go for it.
I'll
want to come rave in a furry outfit, just don't overheat and die out there on the dance floor.
Exactly. I'll tell you what, at most nightclubs I go to, if you're trying to get through the dance floor, it's kind of impossible because people are pushing, shoving, or they're just some people can be really aggressive, right? And at a con rave, it is nothing but respectful. Like people will, like, if you see someone trying to get out of the way, people will like preemptively get out of the way for you, no matter how crowded it is. It's just what I love about the con rave scene is that people are significantly more respectful of people's spaces and boundaries. I really enjoy that environment a lot compared to the traditional spaces, I find.
Yeah. I've done Dragon Con and MomoCon a couple of times, and I particularly like Dragon Con, even though it is so big now. It's 40,000 people in Atlanta, but I describe it to people as it's a place where anybody that doesn't fit into the mainstream goes, whether you're into sci-fi, anime, computer games,
right.
BDSM, it doesn't matter. You have a place to go in Dragon Con.
It is. It's a fun. I don't like to use the word escape a lot, but it is a fun escape. It really is. You meet a lot of really interesting people, a lot of kind people, I think, in these spaces.
Yeah. Talking about meeting kind people, meeting interesting people. I understand you've been to Japan a couple times.
Yes, I have been to Japan probably 6-7 times now. Yeah.
Awesome. Where all have you been?
It's funny. I've only been to Tokyo. It's just such a lame foreigner answer. But but Tokyo is so big. I feel like I've only scratched the surface in all the times I've went.
I mean, it's one of the biggest cities on the planet. I mean, and they've got all these different sub-districts. Every one of them's got its own characters.
Have you been? Have you been before?
I have. I've been to Tokyo and Kyoto.
Nice.
And I purposefully picked those two because I wanted to see both the old and the new Japan.
Nice.
And Tokyo, of course, was completely built from the ground up, and Kyoto was one of the few cities that wasn't bombed. So,
right.
You get to see a lot of the old shrines in Kyoto. When you were in Tokyo, any of those times, did you get out to Akihabara?
Yes. So funny enough, So the reason why actually I haven't traveled much in Japan is because every time I've gone, it's actually been for work or some work-related purpose. And so my first show, the first time performing in Japan, was at this club in Akiba, at this club called Mogra. And Mogra is specifically a nightclub that caters to anime, song, video game music of that subgenre of dance music. It's a really unique space. And so for people who love that kind of that hyper niche of dance music, celebrating that nerdom or fandom, that is the club for it. I think Poor Robinson has even played there once. Like, it's a really interesting space.
Describe for my listeners who haven't been to Tokyo, much less this particular district, describe Akihabara to them. So what is it like? So
the short name for it is called Akiba, and Akiba is basically, for lack of a better word, it's like the mecca of anime and video games. And so all of these like major companies, so like you go there and like it's just stores and cafes and events and spaces that are just for anything you can think of within any kind of fandom you can imagine, whether that's, obviously video games, anime, and all the subgenres of video games and anime and comics and robots and, just electronics, just general electronics even. There's a lot of really cool, like, there's electronic toys and tools and things you can get there. It's a really fascinating place.
It really is. And I think one of the things that struck me about Tokyo is how much you have to spend time looking up. So if you're looking for a particular store, it may be on the 12th floor, right. Or if you are interested in I've never been anywhere else where there are 12 floors of comic books, but there are not just one, but multiple buildings dedicated to comics and anime. I was fascinated. It even sort of blends with the Shinto religion. There's a shrine there, a very famous shrine called the Kanda Shrine. But in the Shinto religion, they have these wooden prayer votives that followers will write a prayer on the back and then leave it at the temple.
Right.
And what's interesting to me is that in the Kanda Shrine, which is in Akiba, they have anime on the backs of these prayer votives.
I didn't know that.
And just this idea, I've got one in my living room. It was so unique. The idea of combining that ancient religion with modern anime just kind of blew my mind.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes, foreigners, in this case, Americans, will kind of not immediately realize that, anime is just such a traditional ingrained part of Japanese culture. It's not just like this kind of commodity. It really is like one and part of Japanese culture in actuality. And so when you hear that story, I'm like, it might sound a little silly at first, but then it's like, oh yeah, no, but anime has been this thing, before it became this kind of commercialized mainstream thing.
Yeah, it has. And it's the anime, the geekdom, the celebration of being intelligent, it's I don't know. I absolutely love it there and hope to get back. But definitely, if you get a chance to go back again, make some time to go visit some of the other parts of Japan too. Kyoto is certainly amazing and easily accessible by the bullet train. So
I'd like to before, unfortunately, because of COVID, that was the original plan, but things happen, right? So it's how it goes. But yes, when I go back, I'd like to have a real proper 4 weeks to just enjoy myself if I can.
Have you? Is most of your performances, is it done sort of one-offs to conventions, or have you planned or are you planning a more traditional tour, for example?
I have always wanted to do a traditional tour. I've never been able to do so. There had been this light discussions with my manager about that. But by and large, I do one-offs, which, to be fair, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's kind of nice to be able to do like because I've heard tours can be very intense. Some people love them, some people hate them. I'm not sure how I feel yet, but it's nice to feel like, all right, I can just go fly to a city for a weekend, get paid, have a fun show, and then fly back home. It's pretty nice to have. For me, I like that on its own, but most of my shows are all one-offs.
Yeah, I think I've heard some artists like Steve Aoki maintain 320 nights a year playing, or some ridiculous number. I have no idea how you find time to produce music at that point, I
don't know how you miss home. I need to be home. I need my home base, personally. Yeah.
How do you balance work and personal life?
That's a good question. I have a good answer for you. No, it is a work in progress, but work and balance, work and leisure these days has gotten better. I don't know if this is a good, healthy answer, but truthfully, as I've gotten more income through royalties, that has lessened my anxieties to pay the bills every month. And therefore then has let me kind of let loose a little more, relax and not stress out because, currently speaking on this podcast, I have my own company and I essentially, independently contract for different clients. Right. So I always have to I have to figure out I am my own salary. And so for several years after I had not worked for Harmonix anymore, the priority was, oh shoot, gotta make money in music. Let's make this happen, So these days it's better. And I try to balance it, by yeah, I really have a good answer for you individually speaking, but emotionally speaking, it feels better. Is it actually good? Time will tell.
Do you find? So I've heard different answers from different artists.
Yeah.
The Mr. Bill podcast had Deadmau5 on a while back, and he talked about spending ridiculous amounts of money because for him that was motivating because he had a lot of bills to pay, and so that financial pressure over his head was, motivating for Joel. In contrast, there's other artists that talk about, that pressure to produce sort of killing their creativity. Where do you find yourself on that spectrum?
So I would say as a producer, I'm pretty good about being structured and creating structure. And that's what keeps me, I actually thrive under pressure. When you don't give me a deadline, I actually don't think I write music very well. And so for any project I do, and usually it's, usually with clients, they'll give me the deadline, and sometimes they're very intense deadlines, right? This last thing I did for Sony was like, hey, James, can you do a remix in 5 days time? I'm like, I guess so. That was a very intense time, but it was worth the project. But so, for original music that I put out, that's just on my own interests, I keep to a fairly tight schedule of like, all right, I'm going to write a song in 1 week, and then I'll kind of poke at it and close the doors by week 2. Because for me, I like to be structured, even creatively speaking. I'm someone who frequently, quote unquote, kills their babies. Like, I'm just like, okay, the song is, I write the song. If it's not perfect, that's okay. Let's close it out and move on. I don't like to keep things open.
So talking about closing out songs, you released a new one just, let's see here, earlier, about a month ago, Squid Rave. Can you tell us about your most recent release?
Yeah, so actually it came out last Friday. So it's been very good. It's been a little less than a week ago. And yeah, it is. So Squid Rave is an original song that I wrote inspired by this game that I've been playing a lot recently called Splatoon, which also there's a big fandom for it. And a lot of people on my Discord who actually got me into the game because they're big fans of Splatoon. For those who don't know, Splatoon is a shooting game made by Nintendo. And so, yeah, I want to kind of have some fun because for me, a lot of the music that I write tends to be on the fun, uplifting side and high energy. And so I thought it'd be a perfect, for me, it was the perfect kind of inspiration to write a song that channels into my kind of high energy, uplifting energy as a person.
Okay. It is definitely a banger. Now, do squids feature prominently in the game? Is that where the name came from, or was it a play on the classic crab rave? Or
no, the crab rave play was kind of a coincidence in retrospect. Okay. No, so Splatoon is so Splatoon is a game where you play as these kind of anamorphic squids, these human squids, essentially. And is a shooter where you essentially, quote unquote, splat with your colored ink. It's kind of like, I'm trying to think of what game it's similar to. But basically, the goal of the game is to get, basically, with your colored ink, get as much of your colored ink on the map compared to the other team. And whoever has the most colored ink wins.
Interesting. Okay. How much time do you spend playing video games? Is that sort of job research for you?
In the past, it used to be. But when I was a kid, it's funny. I used to be a smart ass to my mom, and because I always wanted to work on video games, and my mom would always yell at me saying, James, you've been playing this game for like 8 hours. Stop playing. Go do your homework. And I'd say, but Mom, I'm doing research. I'm studying, and I was right. I was studying.
Your mom's going to be listening to this podcast and like she's like, "Yep, yeah. He was right."
The few times I was right to my parents, finally. Yes. But these days, yeah. So I'd say I try to play, a few hours of a video game per night because video games are what I love doing. Most games. It's funny when I worked at Harmonix. As a full-time employee playing games. Or not playing games, but, sometimes it was actually. When I was a full-time employee, there was this kind of feeling of like, okay, I'm spending literally all of my hours doing game stuff. But now outside of a company structure, it's when we're doing more just the music side of things and not in the trenches of game development. I have grown to appreciate just playing games for leisure more. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Right.
It does.
Yeah.
When it's not part of your job requirement.
Right. It's like when I was working on Rock Band 4, which I didn't do music for, that was more of like the audio design for it. When I was doing Rock Band 4, right, the last thing I want to do and go home is play Rock Band, right? So that I would say for the benefit of my happiness, I'm glad to be out of that space because now I can just play video games and not think about the development of things. But a kind of consequence is once you kind of go into game development and know how games work under the hood, you definitely you definitely see a lot of the cracks of game development that I would have never noticed when I was a kid. That is an unfortunate consequence.
It's a little like being a producer and listening to music. It's hard to just relax. You're picking out, that hi-hat sounds bad, and they should have made the transient sharper on the snare. And
exactly.
Okay. All right. Very cool. Well, so you just released on Friday Squid Rave. What's next for you? We're coming out of the pandemic. Where are you taking things the rest of the year?
So at least on original music, Squid Wave was the first of monthly releases I'll be doing. So I've written a bunch of music over the past year, and I'll be, releasing, I have a new track coming out this month, I think June 25th, and then the next month, and so on and so forth, because I want to continue having monthly recurring releases. I have a bunch of game projects and some anime adjacent projects that I can talk about more later, but the life of game composer is always having NDAs I can't share for the longest time. Like there's some projects that I've worked on years ago that I think will come out this year that I can talk about, but who knows? It's kind of a mystery.
Video games don't have a firm release date many times. It's kind of flexible, and that drives what you can and can't talk about.
It can. So it's really all. As I continue repeating this point, video games are just all over the place. A game like No Straight Roads has been delayed like 6 or 7 times internally. It was supposed to come out 2018, and then it didn't come out until 2020, right? Other games come out exactly when they say they're supposed to. It's just games. It's not necessarily a fault of the developer. It's there's just so many factors and so many things. COVID obviously did a huge number on delays, right? So it can be a lot of reasons for a game to not come out when they say they're supposed to.
You kind of alluded to working on some anime, but then you said you may not be able to talk about it. Is there anything you could talk about with the anime projects now, or will I have to wait for a future podcast?
I'll have to wait for the future podcast, unfortunately.
All right.
I'll say this, that the anime industry is, if I'll say this, unlike games, I think is which a little more loose about kind of like the legality of things. Japanese companies I've worked with are very intense. You do not go out. Japanese companies in general, not just anime per se, but Japanese companies are very intense about you stay within your lane and you do not go outside of that without proper permissions and hierarchies of those permissions, right? Sometimes it can be like, I can't speak to what project this is, but there was one case where like I wanted to use a logo for something, and it should be as simple as just putting like a JPEG on a screen, and I was not allowed to do that without getting layers of approvals. It's pretty intense.
Interesting. I don't know that's. I think that's probably true of most big businesses, even American corporations. I've got an interview coming up with someone who works for Universal, and it was the first time that I've had to run my questions by their PR department before I could have them on the show, so that was a new experience for me. Usually it's just, we'll just talk about what we're going to talk about. So
yeah, no. And to be fair, like I on one level, I understand why corporations have to be that way. It's just not always. As someone who's been on the other side of that coin, I get it. I also understand that there's just layers of, bureaucracy and, red tape, and it's a whole system over there. Yeah.
Okay. Well, when you get to the point where you can talk about your anime projects, I would love to have you back on the podcast.
Absolutely.
And this has been a really enjoyable talk. I really appreciate your time, and I've learned a lot about the video game industry, and I know my listeners are really going to enjoy this episode.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. It's been honestly a great time. Thank you so much.
You are welcome. Where can people find you online?
So the best place to find me, if you Google James Landino, all my socials can be available there. Twitter.com/James Landino, or, Discord.gg/James Landino, or YouTube, right? So if you search me as James Landino, you'll find everything you need there.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time, James.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening. I'll have lots of links for you on the show notes page, including one to James's new track, Squid Rave. So check out producerlifepodcast.com and look for episode 75. If you enjoyed this interview, please leave a rating and review wherever you're listening. It really helps others find the podcast. As always, you can find me on social media at House Ninja Music. And until next week, don't forget to be somebody's hero.